Should I start? Dear students, as we have already discussed Unit 1 and 2 of our course on History of English Literature Part 2, and these two units are all about Victorian literature, early Victorians and later Victorians. Just to help you revise the two units, particularly with reference to the novelists and their works, I have just compiled some important information which may help you prepare for exams. As discussed in the class also, Victorian age is all about conflict between science and faith, and at the same time it was an age of phenomenal literary happenings, and these literary happenings could take place with industrialization, transportation and communication services in the background. This age was also important for the British Empire to expand itself like anything, and at the same time this was the age of reforms, social, economic and political. Edward Bulwer-Lytton has rightly called this age as an age of transition, as an age of disquietude and doubt. With all these important things in background, particularly Victorian age as the age of reforms, starting with Reform Bill 1832, there was a response. And that response was in the form of Chartist movement. And this movement was actually a working class movement against a particular clause of property as a qualification for voting rights, which excluded the working class. Therefore, Chartist movement was one important movement that took place during the Victorian age. Second important movement that was launched during Victorian age was Oxford or Tractarian movement. It was called as Oxford movement particularly because Oxford was at the center of all happenings related to this very movement. It was a movement related to English Church, and of course John Cablet, he is called as the most important leader of the movement, and he started this movement in 1833. Later on, of course, he was joined by John Henry Newman, Richard Hurrell, Freud and others, who launched the series titled as Tracts for the Times in 1833. If we talk about later Victorian age, then of course Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, it was one very important artistic and literary movement, and this brotherhood was formed in 1848. And in initial years, it was led by Everett Milesh, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and William Holman Hunt. Later on, poetry of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Morris, and A.C. Swinburne dominated pre-Raphaelite movement. And as you all know, that this movement in a way commemorates the period prior to high Renaissance in Italy, And that's why it is rightly named as pre-Raphaelite period. This was the age known for aesthetic movement, particularly during the later part of Victorian age. And this movement was launched under the influence of pre-Raphaelites, particularly two important figures, John Ruskin and Walter Pater, who propagated art for art's sake. Because this presentation is all about early Victorian novelists, let's first of all try to know as to who were the important novelists who dominated Victorian age. If we go chronologically, then Bulwer Lytton, Benjamin Disraeli, Elizabeth Gaskell, William Makepeace Thackeray, Charles Dickens, very important name, Anthony Trollope, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Anne Bronte, and George Eliot were some of the very, very important novelists of Victorian age. To start with Bronte sisters, they were three. Charlotte Bronte was, of course, the eldest among them, and she contributed four very, very important novels: Jane Eyre, Shirley, Villette, and The Professor. These were the four novels produced by Charlotte Bronte, eldest of the three sisters. Emily Bronte wrote very, very important novel, adapted into a movie also, Wuthering Heights. Emily Bronte is particularly known for this very important work. Anne Bronte, she wrote two very important novels. One was Agnes Grey, and the second one was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. One thing is very important about these three sisters, that they wrote their works. Most of the works they wrote were written under the pseudonyms. Charlotte Bronte used the synonym Currer, Currer, and Emily Bronte wrote under the pseudonym Ellis, Ellis, while Anne Bronte, she wrote with the pseudonym Acton Bell, Actonbell, Acton Bell. Acton Bell, Anne Bronte's pseudonym. Currer was pseudonym of Charlotte Bronte, and Ellis was pseudonym of Emily Bronte. Once again, because it is very, very important slide from the perspective of Bronte sisters, please remember two, three very, very important things. Charlotte was the eldest among the three, and Charlotte's Jane Eyre, it was one very important work. And then, of course, Emily Bronte, middle one, she wrote Wuthering Heights as her masterpiece. Anne Bronte, she wrote Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And of course, they used the pseudonyms for their writings. Charlotte Bronte used the synonym Currer, Emily Bronte used the synonym Ellis, and Anne Bronte used the synonym Acton Bell. Now, if we talk about the most important novelist of early Victorian age, then of course we come across Charles Dickens, very, very important novelist of early Victorian age. who made this age truly engaging age from literary perspective particularly, and who of course depicted different walks of life, particularly the working class, their exploitation, divide between the rich and the poor, exploitation of child laborers rather. And this is how Charles Dickens may be considered as the most important novelist of early Victorian age. If we divide his writings in three phases, then between 1837 to 1842, he produced Sketches by Boz. This was his first fictional writing, Sketches by Boz, and it was written in the form of sketches, and that's why title also indicates it. Then he also wrote during this period the Pickwick Papers, very popular writing, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barn by Rouge, and American Notes, just to talk about very, very important writings. The second phase, starting from 1843 to 1853, was equally engaging for Charles Dickens as a literary figure of early Victorian age. And during this phase, he wrote Martin Chuzzlewit, A Christmas Carol, Dombey and Son, David Copperfield, Bleak House, A Child's History, History of England. Then in the last phase of his career as a writer, particularly as a novelist, some of the very, very important writings could come out. Hard Times is one such writing, followed by Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend, and The Mystery of Edwin Drood. These are some of the important literary contributions of Charles Dickens as a novelist. I hope this information will supplement your understanding of this very novelist who happened to make this important age as an age of great literary happenings. Then Thackeray and Anthony Trollope. William Makepeace Thackeray, born in 1811 and died in 1863. And within this period of almost 52 years, he produced The Luck of Barry Lyndon, The Book of Snobs, Vanity Fair, Pendenish, The History of Henry Esmond, The Newcomes, The Virginians, English humorists of the 18th century, and The Four Georges as important fictional writings. Anthony Trollope, born in 1815 and died in 1882, contributed hugely to Victorian novel, early Victorian novel particularly, with writings or with novels like The Warden, Barchester Towers, Dr. Thorney, Framley Parsonage, The Small House at Ellington, The Last Chronicle of Barset, Can You Forgive Her, Finish Finn, Finish Redux, The Prime Minister, The Duke's Children, and The Way We Live Now as major literary contributions of Anthony Trollope. George Eliot, a very, very popular writer, was born in 1819 and died in 1880, and produced some very, very important novels, including The Mill on the Floor, Scenes of Clerical Life, Adam Bede, Silas Marna, Romola, Felix Holt the Radical, Middlemarch, Daniel Deronda, then of course Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli was very important for three novels particularly: Sibyl or the Two Nations, Coningsby and Tancred, though he also produced Lothair. Elizabeth Gaskell, as a novelist of Victorian age, produced Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester Life, Cranford, Wives and Daughters, Ruth, and North and South. Other important Victorian novelists included Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll was actually the pseudonym of Charles Ludwig Dodgson. It was not his actual name, rather it was pseudonym with which he became very popular. And he was popular as a writer of Alice Adventures in Wonderland and its sequel, titled as Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. Wilkie Collins, he was also a novelist of prominence and produced Antonia, Basil, Hide and Seek, The Woman in White, No Name, The Moonstone, Man and Wife, Low and the Lady, and Heart and Science. One more important novelist, Bulwer Lytton, who considered this age to be the age of disquietude, as an age of transition. He also contributed important novels like Falkland, Pelham, The Disowned, Godolphin, The Last Days of Pompey, and many others. After discussing these writers whom we may place as early Victorian novelists particularly, there was a figure who made late Victorian novel as interesting and engaging. His name was Thomas Hardy, and Thomas Hardy particularly wrote about rustic life. He particularly wrote about the role of fate and chance, and this is how I have tried to put together his writings under two headings. One is novels of character and environment, and if we talk about the novels of character and environment written by Hardy, then Under the Greenwood Tree, Far from the Madding Crowd, The Return of the Native, The Mayor of Casterbridge, The Woodlanders, Tess of the Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure are very important novels. He also wrote some novels which may be put under the category romances and fantasies, and under this category there are three important titles: A Pair of Blue Eyes, The Trumpet Major, and Two on a Tower. And this is how we tried to revise our understanding of important novelists of Victorian age and their important novels. Here I would like to suggest to you that our understanding of Victorian age will remain incomplete unless we have some idea about important social, cultural, scientific and literary events which took place during this particular age, and that's why I have given here an index of entries, an index of events, literary events and other events for your consumption. For example, if we talk about as to how industrialization, mechanization and communication and transportation services developed like anything during the Victorian age, then we need to understand as to how in the year 1825, first steam locomotive could be designed, and it paved the way for transportation to develop. And then of course 1832, a very, very important year, because this was the year when first Reform Act was introduced, and it invited response of the working class who were not happy about the provision of property clause as a qualification for voting rights. 1833, for example, was very, very important because during 1833 slavery was abolished by British Empire, and it paved the way for other forms of hiring the labor and indentured labor. This was one such development which took place after abolition of slavery. In the same year, 1833, Thomas Carlyle, he wrote Sartor Resartus. And this is how I would request you to go through this entire index of entries just to understand as to how the important events took place in the Victorian age and how those events influenced the literary happenings of the time or literary works of the time. For example, 1838, Chartist movement. And of course this Chartist movement was against First Reform Act, particularly one such clause about property as a qualification for voting right. Similarly, I would like to talk about as to how postal services, economical postal services started with introduction of penny postage in 1840. It was a very, very important happening. And then of course 1841, this was the year known for economic depression in England. And of course for this very important happening, 1840s was called as Hungry 40s. Hungry 40s because this was the decade characterized by economic depression. Then of course it also talks about 1845 as the year of potato blight and great famine. And then on the right hand side of this index, literary events are also mentioned, and I hope you will enjoy the index. 1848 was very important for you to understand as to how this was not an ordinary age in terms of social and cultural life of the people, because 1848 was the year of cholera epidemic. 1849 was the year when one very important happening took place, and that was abolition of corn laws. And 1851, a very, very major event was conducted, and name of that event was Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. And this event was actually organized by husband of the Queen. 1853 again, this is known as an year of cholera epidemic. 1857, as we all know, Indian Mutiny, or first movement of independence for the Indians, started with the year 1857. 1859, a very, very important year, because this was the year when Darwin's theory of evolution could be conceptualized through the text on the origin of species. And then 1862, cotton famine in England, very important happening. 1865, women's suffrage movement, when women started asking for voting rights for women also. And of course it was a very, very important movement that started with this very initiative. And 1871, I am just picking out some of the important events. 1871 was the year when trade unions were legalized and Darwin published Descent of Man. And this text again made people interrogate biblical concept of descent of man. And in 1873, East India Company was dissolved and Home Rule League was established. 1874 was the year when Women's Trade Union League was established, and these were some of the important activities which could somehow help the working class raise their voice against the exploitation which was very common during industrialization. Then in 1882, married women gained full property rights, and it was a very, very important happening. Then if you talk about sociological happenings or events of Victorian age, and in 1886, mothers were granted rights over children on the death of the father. And this was the year when first bicycle was manufactured. In 1893, this was the year when diesel engine was invented. And 1897 was the year when wireless radio was invented. But at the same time, 1896 was not a very good year, because during this year, Oxford and Cambridge universities denied admission to women, and it was in a way a discouraging act for women right activists particularly. Then of course, discovery of radium in 1898, foundation of Labour Party in 1900, and death of Queen Victoria in the year 1901. If we go further, then very important event, that is outbreak of First World War in 1914. With this, I would like you to go through this entire presentation just to revise both the units on Victorian age, particularly with reference to the important novelists who contributed to development of this very age as an important age for important literary events. while preparing this presentation, I have referred three important texts. One is Palgrave Macmillan, A History of English Literature. Second is the Oxford Companion to English Literature. And third important text that I consulted was Key Concepts in English Literature, Victorian Literature. Thanks a lot. This is how I would request every student to make best use of your time while you stay at home. With this, I wish you all the very best. Thank you. Thanks a lot.